So a couple of days ago, I was asked by a coworker to look at their Echo trimmer. Not having any self-control, of course, I said yes, and this is what they brought me. However, what they didn't tell me was that it had extra baggage with it, and not only that, but I wasn't the first one to look at it. So is that a problem? You bet it is, because now I have to solve twice as many problems. Not that I mind, a project is just that, but I certainly don't need it to be any harder than it needs to be. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Echo string trimmer, and the problem is that it tries to start, but it's not wanting to stay running. Here's the strange part. As you can see, it has a brand new, and I mean unused, trimmer head on it. Not only that, but it also came with what I can only assume is the original ignition coil loosely strapped to the handle. Now, I'm going to try and repair this string trimmer, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now, the label that's on the trimmer says it's an SRM230, but it seems to have some plastic covers from a different trimmer, which is kind of confusing. So as you can see by the way the insulating wrap looks like on the spark plug wire, the ignition coil that's on the trimmer right now looks to be brand new. However, we need to confirm that there isn't anything wrong with it, and then we can move on with the rest of the diagnostic work. So to test if the ignition coil works, I'm going to remove the plug from the engine and then reconnect the wire to it while grounding the plug. Now, doing it this way will make it easier to pull over, and it should make seeing the spark a lot easier as well. Now, it's safe to say that we have a working ignition system, which is great news for us. Next, I want to perform a compression test to see if the engine is worn out. If the compression is low, it might explain why the engine won't stay running. We want to see a reading well over 100 psi, and the higher the better. So the reading is a very high 150 psi, which is great news for us. It means the engine is not worn out, and it's not the cause of it not wanting to stay running. Next, I'm going to spray some fuel into the engine and replace the plug, and then we'll try starting it again. So from that test start, you can see and hear that it's not wanting to stay running. Also, after trying to purge the fuel system of any air, the bulb is not filling with any fuel, which means we'll need to take a look at the carb as well. There's also some very sticky stuff on the handle, so before I continue to work with it, I'm going to try and clean some of it off. I've never had this issue come up with any trimmer before, so this is quite unique. However, even after spraying and rinsing it off, it's still very sticky, but at least it's not dirty anymore. I can only guess the stickiness is the material breaking down from some kind of chemical that's gotten onto it. It also looks like whoever installed the fuel tank last forgot to pass the bolt through the plastic guard as well. It's not a big deal, but I'll take care of that later on when we get the bulk of the repairs done first. Now, because there's a couple of issues with this string trimmer, I'm also going to take the plastic cover off and take a look around mainly as a precaution. That, and I intend on getting to the muffler to inspect the spark arrestor screen for any clogs as well. Of course, while the cover is off the engine, I'm also going to be checking for any dirt and grime that might be covering the cooling fins. Don't forget this engine is air-cooled, so any dirt that's covering the fins could cause the engine to overheat while it's running. And if it does overheat and you continue to use it, it could cause some serious damage to the engine. Now, strangely enough, the bolts for the muffler were already loose. Not sure if the last person who worked on it forgot to tighten them, but I will let you know it's very rare to find these bolts loose. And since we've got the muffler off the engine, we're also going to take this opportunity to look at the piston and rings as well, just to make sure they're in good condition, which they are. Also, if you see deep scratches on the side of the piston, it might explain why your engine won't start. Next, we're going to take a look at the spark arrestor screen in the muffler to make sure it's not clogged with carbon. And luckily for us, this one doesn't seem to have any carbon buildup on it. Now, if yours has some carbon buildup on it, I would recommend that you clean the screen with some heat or a good carb cleaner. It's also best to reinstall the screen after you get it cleaned as well, otherwise you run the risk of starting a grass fire. Now, I know a lot of consumers who work on their own machines will leave the screens out, fearing that the screen will clog up again. However, if you use the trimmer at full speed like you're supposed to, this should be enough to keep extra carbon from forming in the engine. So there is quite a bit of dirt and grime on certain parts of this engine, and the best way to deal with it is to clean it off. Now, I did have a viewer who was very concerned about the way I was washing the machines I work on, and to be honest, their concerns are pretty valid. However, if you're very careful and don't spray water into the engine, you should be just fine. Now, if for some reason you don't think you'll be able to keep water from getting inside your engine, well, then don't do it. So besides loose bolts on the muffler, I also noticed the creative way the throttle cable was routed around the trimmer. Unfortunately, this is one of many terrible lack of detail issues with this machine, and as we get further into this project, you'll see what I mean. So now that we know this engine has plenty of spark and compression, the only thing that we need to look at now is the fuel delivery, specifically the carb. Now the most likely reason would be that there's a blockage in the carb preventing fuel from passing through it, or the diaphragm controlling fuel flow has become petrified and is not allowing any fuel to pass through it. Also, this return line back to the fuel tank seems to be showing signs of shrinkage at the grommet, so we're going to replace it later on. Now, even though this purge bulb is not damaged, it's beginning to discolor, and since we're going to take it off anyway, we might as well change that out as well. So here's my take on servicing one of these carbs. It's not for everyone, and even though it's not difficult to do, you can still run into a couple of issues with them. So if you've never done it before, I would recommend that you just buy replacement carb instead. That way, you won't have to question if you did a good enough job of cleaning that carb and possibly getting your machine up and running sooner without all the headaches. Basically, what I'm doing is carefully taking apart the carb and getting it to a bare state so I can put it into the ultrasonic cleaner. The other issue with the carb is that the metering diaphragm in it is in really bad shape. It's not petrified, but because of all the wrinkles on it, it's not able to work like it should. That might explain why this engine is acting the way that it is. So if you're trying to service this carb, you'd also have to find the correct metering diaphragm as well, which for some is quite difficult to do, but you wouldn't have to do that if you just bought a new carb instead. Now, once all the tiny parts are off the carb, I'll then put the parts into a glass jar of my cleaning solution. For those of you who are asking why I use a glass jar in the basin, it's because the solution I'm using is very flammable. And to reduce the chance for a fire, I'm trying to isolate it from the rest of the machine. Now, I have tried other solvents from a purple color to a green one with varying amounts of water, and unfortunately, I haven't had much success with them. Now, you might have better luck with those other solutions, but so far this method has yielded the best results, at least for me. Now, I am still trying to refine my process, so who knows how much longer I'll be using this method. So it turns out the fuel filter line and the filter are in great condition. In fact, it appears that the lines and grommets are practically brand new. However, it also looks like the last person was trying to reuse the old return line instead of replacing it. I'm not going to guess as to the reason why they did this, so in the meantime, I'll just replace the return line and get back to putting the carb back together. And even though I just ran the parts through the ultrasonic cleaner, I'm still going to use some carb cleaner on the parts just to make sure they're clean. I also want to do one more thing while I'm here, which is to get access to the hidden fuel adjustment screws. Now the reason they're hidden is because they don't want you to mess with them, which makes sense as to why they're covered up in the first place. I will let you know that if you do this wrong, you could damage the screw heads that you're trying to uncover. So be extremely careful, otherwise you won't be able to turn them, and that might just make that carb pretty much useless. Now that the screw heads are exposed, I'm going to start to put the carb back together again. This is when things can go horribly wrong, and what I mean by that is that you can accidentally lose one of these tiny parts. And if that does happen, you might as well just order a new carb instead, because finding that part you dropped will be very difficult. Now, I buy my diaphragms in bulk, which means I buy them in packs of 20 or more, which makes each one very cheap. Not only that, but I'll buy different versions of them. That way, there's a good chance that I'll have the one I need on hand when I need them, and I won't have to wait for them to come in the mail. Of course, you're not going to buy them in bulk, you're just going to buy the one, and if you do, just expect to pay well over $5 for each one. However, if you intend on keeping the trimmer you have right now for a long time, then you might just want to consider buying a pack of at least 3 of them to use in the future. So here's a trick to figure out which port on the carb is the return port. So I'm going to put this fuel line on the port that I think is for the return. Next, I'll drop the other end of the line, which also has a fuel filter on it, into some gasoline. Then I'm going to press on the bulb a couple of times, and if it is the return line, bubbles will come out of the fuel filter. Just as I thought, that port was the return line, but what happens if you put the line on the wrong port? So if you do it this way, you'll have put the fuel line on the supply port for the carb, and when pressing the bulb, gasoline will be pulled up to the carb and fuel will come out the other port. Of course, this is how the fuel lines would be normally installed on the carb, but testing it this way does make quite the mess. After that test, we'll then install the carb and the airbox and then reconnect the fuel lines to it. So on this particular carb, the larger port near the engine is the supply from the tank, while the smaller port closer to the airbox is the return back to the tank. Now, be very careful that you do not mix these up, otherwise the screen inside the carb will eventually get clogged with debris and keep it from working. So when pressing the bulb, fuel will come up the supply line into the carb, then it will fill the bulb, and then eventually leave the carb by the return line and go back to the tank. And as you can see, after pressing the bulb a couple of times, fuel is filling the bulb and leaving through the return line. Now, if yours is not filling with fuel, it could mean something's wrong inside the carb, or there's a problem with the fuel filter or even the lines. Now, it may not be worth your time to take it apart and look at it again, and most times it's something that you can't fix, and it's just better if you just bought a new carb instead. So this is when things get a little bit strange. After getting everything put back onto the engine, I had my screwdriver at the ready to start adjusting the carb if it needs it. Now the screw at the top of the carb is the low speed adjustment, and it's the one we're going to be tackling first if we can't get it to start. However, once I tried to start it, I noticed one terrible fact about it. That terrible fact was that even after all that work, it was still acting the same way as before. Now, I didn't record it, but I did try to make some adjustments to the carb, but the results were exactly the same. That brings me to a terrible conclusion that even with spark, fuel, and plenty of compression from the engine, the problem was still something else. And we'll have to dig even deeper into the engine to find out what the problem really is. So the problem could be the ignition timing is off because the flywheel key is broken, or it might even be the ignition coil itself. But we won't know until we take it apart again and find out what all's been touched and probably broken. I don't like easy projects, and this one is definitely going to go down as one of those that wasn't easy at all. So my question is, what do you think the problem is? Do you think it's a timing, spark, or even a fuel issue? Now, I do have a pretty good idea what the problem really is, but I was just wondering if you see something else I might be missing. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.